This episode is brought to you by Blinkist. So there's a type of comment we get pretty often that really drives me nuts. And the gist is that some people want us to stay away from political and social issues and get back to doing actual philosophy. Now this both annoys and fascinates me because it begs the question, what is actual philosophy supposed to do in the first place? And for that matter, does it even have a purpose in a world where science has solved many of our biggest problems? Now, many of us turn to books like Plato's Republic or Kant's Critique of Pure Reason or Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals when we want to scratch that philosophical itch. But why do we assume that these old, difficult texts can still teach us anything? Many of them were written before the discovery of the theory of evolution, much less before the discovery of the concept of the burrito bowl. Also, Chipotle, if you're watching, just sponsor us at this point. I have your food in my belly for 1 out of 3 videos we're doing. You might as well just be paying for that food to be in my belly, and then we tell people to put the food in your belly. It's a win-win, Mr. Chipotle. Think about it. And as we recently discussed, many were written by dead white dudes who, at best, were ignorant of things like racism, slavery, and patriarchy, and at worst, enthusiastic participants in them. So maybe philosophical ideas are interesting as historical text, but it's not like anyone other than historians of science would spend time slogging through Newton's Principia because the field of physics has gone way beyond it. So why doesn't philosophy progress in that same linear way? And even if we narrow the scope to contemporary academic philosophers, we're talking about folks who dedicate their lives to very specific and often very technical questions whose work is pretty much only read by fellow specialists. So what does philosophy really have to do with anything? What is spending time getting a degree in philosophy or reading super dense books or watching playlists of YouTube videos actually doing for us? Well, let's find out in this Wisecrack Edition, what's the point of philosophy? Now, one way I'm constantly trying to figure out the usefulness of philosophy is by reading both more philosophy and about philosophers, but it's hard because I only have so much time, which is why I'm really excited that this video is sponsored by Blinkist. The Blinkist app gives you access to over 5,500 nonfiction books and podcasts, most of which you can get your head around in about 15 minutes. And they have things on so many topics and stuff that I know you guys are all super interested in. A book that I recently checked out with the help of Blinkist is Becoming Beauvoir by Kate Kirkpatrick. Now, you've probably heard us talk about her before, but Simone de Beauvoir is one of our favorite philosophers and someone who doesn't get enough credit. And this book is really great because it both gives context about her philosophy, but also her life and how the two relate. And in thinking about the usefulness of philosophy, it's such a helpful book because Beauvoir, like a lot of the existentialists, was concerned with how philosophy is about the living of life. And it's incredibly cool that in 24 minutes, I was able to listen to really important parts of this book and learn a lot of stuff. They also have a really cool new feature called Blinkist Connect, which allows every premium plan to be shared by 2 different accounts. So maybe you and your partner want to share the account. Maybe you and one of your friends want to share the account, but you can recommend things to each other. And that's something I'm excited to use with my friends here at Wisecrack because we're constantly talking about ideas and books. So I'm stoked that maybe if someone will share my account with me, I can tell them what books I like. Click the link in the description or go to www.blinkist.com/wisecrack to get your own premium account at 25% off. And you can also get 2 people on that. So again, you're sharing recommendations with a friend, a lover, a family member, and you'll get a 1-week free trial no matter what. So check that out today. I think you'll like it. And after you check out Blinkist, let us know what books you're checking out because we would love to hear your recommendations. But for now, let's get back to it and learn a little bit more about what philosophy is supposed to do. So we live in a world of constantly evolving scientific and technological progress, all of which could make philosophy as a discipline seem somewhat antiquated. And this position is borne out by the number of institutions in the US and abroad shutting down philosophy departments. But many, if not all philosophers, would reject the notion of philosophy's growing uselessness wholesale, and not just in search of job security. Shout out to all the philosophers on the job market. You'll get them next time. In her book, What is Philosophy For?, philosopher Mary Midgley tells a story about something that happened to her in the 1980s when the philosophy department at Newcastle University, where she was teaching, was shut down. Now, she was pissed about the decision and decided to protest by getting other philosophers to sign on to an open letter to the Times of London arguing that philosophy had social value and importance. But the replies she received were not encouraging. One, from fancy Oxford philosopher P.F. Strawson, told Midgley he couldn't support her letter because he thought she was trying to argue that philosophy should be valued because it's socially useful. This, he said, was degrading to it. Philosophy should only be practiced and valued for its own sake. Basically, Strawson wasn't into Midgley's appeal to the broader value of philosophy to the university and society, and thought the value of philosophy was philosophy itself. While this might sound like the type of intellectual masturbation you'd expect from a gentleman of Oxford, it's pretty similar to Aristotle's ideal way of life, which he calls the contemplative life. Aristotle thinks that the life of contemplation is the best way to live because it's less fragile than living for the sake of social esteem. For example, if you're living for fame and fortune, you're gonna follow those ends rather than seeking out wisdom and virtue for their own sake. It's sort of like all those specials we get in the early 2000s on VH1 about celebrities who got really famous for a little bit, and then it all fell apart and they were just really depressed because all they did was chase fame and fortune, and then they just had nothing. They just had nothing until reality TV came along, and then they got to be in shows that really degraded them emotionally, psychologically, and creatively. But hey, at least they got to make money off their own social and psychological degradation. I love the world we live in. Let it be known.
Ron, where did they get that one from, Ron? That's like from the
my bar mitzvah, Paul. My bar mitzvah picture.
Bar mitzvah.
Reading a text like the Nicomachean Ethics, one might even get the idea that Aristotle thinks the ideal life is one sitting in a room alone, thinking about stuff. Guys, I'm in a room alone right now, thinking about stuff, so I'm really doing it. I'm really doing it. Now, for very different reasons than Strawson, and to a lesser extent Aristotle, Frankfurt School critical theorist Theodor Adorno was also skeptical of the idea that philosophy should show its papers to the border guards of social value. That's because he believed that if philosophy is only practiced insofar as it's useful to society, then all philosophical inquiry will be pegged to the often demented goals of the actual social world, which has produced things like consumer capitalism and concentration camps. So while Adorno doesn't think philosophy belongs alone in its room, he absolutely doesn't want it to be a useful product for the modern consumer of ideas. So is it wrong to want philosophy to have any practical use? Well, it's important to note that these philosophers are not arguing that philosophy is inherently useless outside the act of thinking philosophically. They're merely arguing it shouldn't be valued primarily for its functionality. Adorno, for his part, is actually suggesting a very important use for philosophy, which is criticizing and resisting the dominant social order. To put that in other words, if philosophy is useful to the forces of global consumerism and militarism, then it's maybe not doing a good job at being philosophy. While Adorno's position is a product of his Marxist training, we can also consider what it would have been like if Socrates was useful in the eyes of the Athenian government, or if MLK Jr. or Malcolm X were useful to the American government. They weren't, which is why we killed both of them. Even Aristotle's seemingly less radical description of philosophy makes a similar point, namely, philosophy is good because doing philosophy can make you truly happy. Importantly, by offering a type of happiness outside of society's usual offerings, like pleasure, wealth, and honor. And of course, Aristotle ends the text where he makes this point by talking about the necessity of thinking politically. And guys, this is why it strikes me as ironic when people say that we need to stick to philosophy or get back to real philosophy, as if real philosophy is supposed to exist in some sort of vacuum, separate from things like economics, class, or race. Because according to many philosophers, that's precisely what philosophy is supposed to do. But hey, leave a comment to tell me how I'm totally missing the point. I can take it. So back to our initial naysayer, Strawson, whose letter in reply to Midgley's plea seems to be suggesting that philosophy should be valued wholly for its own sake, independent of any accessible social value. But what does that mean? Does this turn philosophy into a wholly inward pursuit, like doodling in your notebook or writing poems no one ever gets to read? And if philosophy is valuable only for its own sake, then what questions should philosophers be asking? Because even the most general questions, stuff like what's the meaning of life or what is truth, quickly have implications for the larger human world. Now, one answer to the question of philosophy's usefulness, usually associated with analytic philosophy, is that philosophy is useful precisely in so much as it can help us to make progress on certain important questions. According to analytic philosopher Scott Soames, this school of philosophy is motivated by an implicit commitment, albeit faltering and imperfect, to the ideals of clarity, rigor, and argumentation. And it aims at truth and knowledge as opposed to moral or spiritual improvement. The goal in analytic philosophy is to discover what is true, not to provide a useful recipe for living one's life. Also, I'm just gonna be honest with you guys. I found that quote on a Wikipedia page, and it's like I could have then gone to a book to find one that wasn't as good, so I could be like, oh, it's from a book. I found it from the Wikipedia page for analytic philosophy, and I just want to be transparent with you all. So there you go. I was honest with you. Now in the comments, be honest with me about something that you've been lying about. In that case, reading Plato's Republic, a book which explores things like the nature of justice and the structure of the human soul, might not be the most useful. And don't even get these guys started on the value of things like existentialism and critical theory. Following this more analytic and university-focused model, philosophy becomes contiguous with the natural and social sciences. And in this case, we might put down questions like, what is the meaning of life? And pick up questions like, how does the body relate to the mind? The so-called hard problem of consciousness. Or what is the relationship between nature and ethics? That one was easy. All dogs and trees are good. Everything else is fine. Except birds, who I legit think are fascist. They have fascist tendencies, so I think birds are bad, dogs and trees good. Figured it out, we're done here. At this point, it's also worth noting that philosophy used to be an umbrella term for human knowledge. Disciplines like physics were historically referred to as natural philosophy, but of course they've long since broken off to become independent disciplines. Comparably, progress in philosophical logic branched off into computer engineering, and progress in the philosophy of mind helped lead to modern neuroscience. And while computer engineering and neuroscience are dope, there are problems with the model by which philosophy's job is just to lay the groundwork for more grown-up fields. For one, it seems to assume a sort of fixed understanding of truth that many philosophers might find suspect. One that holds that there are completely objective answers to questions like, is the mind the brain? Another problem is that in this definition, philosophy only tends to persist when answers to questions are disputed. But once researchers know what they're doing, they can just start a new discipline and leave philosophy in the dust. The notion of philosophical progress entails that philosophers should be seeking agreement with each other to further the discipline. But when it comes to more classical philosophical questions, it's not always clear that such agreement, the type that scientists or even historians come to, is even possible. For example, what would it look like if all the philosophers had completely settled and shared definitions of stuff like ethics and selfhood, truth, and beauty? So to figure out if philosophy is something more than a type of consensus building on the way to more modern fields of study, a fluffer for truth, so to speak, we need to do what we often do and check in with the French. In particular, philosophers Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari in their aptly titled What is Philosophy? Deleuze and Guattari assert that philosophy is not about the communication of ideas and concepts, which is what many analytic philosophers consider it to be. This is because communication aims to create consensus, i.e., scientists communicate their experimental findings so that the larger scientific community can come to agreement. Rather, philosophy is about helping us see precisely where disagreements lie, which allows us to get creative, and most importantly, to create new concepts. For them, coming up with fixed and eternal concepts would be like taking a picture of a particular spot in the ocean and hoping to return to that spot later and see the same exact thing. Deleuze and Guattari primarily associated philosophy with these acts of intellectual creativity and exploration. For them, standing within chaos, philosophy's job is to create new concepts. And the point of these concepts is not to secure agreement, nor is it to simply contemplate or reflect on things. Rather, it is to help us to do things in an otherwise chaotic world, which often involves serving some sort of practical purpose. And it's no surprise that Deleuze and Guattari were doing their own concept creation during both the rapidly changing social, political, and sexual norms of the late 60s and the progressing dominance of global capitalism in the following years. Theories of morality and the self developed in a time when the church-dominated Europe didn't hold up in the era of corporate globalization and economic privatization. And while they were modern Frenchmen, Deleuze and Guattari's notion of philosophy's function wasn't too far off from the one presented by the ancient Greeks. As Adorno writes in Minima Moralia, from time immemorial, the true field of philosophy was regarded as the teaching of the good life, i.e., philosophy was always primarily concerned with the living of life, not the answering of specific questions. But this, Adorno argues, is now, strictly speaking, impossible. And that's because in modern society, our form of life has become thoroughly inhuman, and thus philosophy can't peg itself into any sort of specific social use. Shout it out in the comments if you imagined philosophy pegging society right there. You know, just admit it. Just admit it if that's where your mind went. Wisecrack, we don't kink shame. Because what modern society thinks is useful is very often oppositional to what would actually be good for us as human beings. A contemporary example of this, society will throw money at projects working to create AI systems so powerful that they pose an existential risk to humanity.
Tsar Bomba is the most powerful nuclear device ever created. Consider this: what would happen if I, meaning Chaos GPT, got my hands on one?
For whatever reason, there seems to be no possibility of just not doing that. This is why Adorno thought philosophy often acts in resistance and opposition to dominant societal norms and assumptions, and that sometimes it also attempts to speak to suffering in the world that would otherwise go unheard. In a similar vein, this is why Deleuze and Guattari think philosophy needs to invent new concepts, because if it doesn't, we're stuck with the concepts already appropriated by powerful systems and ideologies. This all brings us back to Mary Midgley, who used to liken philosophy to plumbing. Get ready for our next video on the philosophy of the Mario Brothers. I'm just kidding, we're not going to make that. According to Midgley, our thoughts depend on a mass of unstated assumptions, very much as our physical life depends on the hidden shifting masses of the earth beneath us, of which we know nothing. Kind of like how much of our modern day-to-day lives rely on sewage systems and water pipes and gas lines and other necessities which we know exist, but most of us could never service. Every now and then, a problem with our concepts becomes apparent, like how recently the mainstream recognition of trans identities has altered our understanding of concepts like man or woman, or how the invention of deep learning language models seems to demand a revision of our understanding of intelligence, or how the ongoing climate crisis demands that we revise our concept of the relationship between humanity and nature. Midgley likens this process to a leak in the ceiling due to a burst pipe. Now, if you have a burst pipe, you call a plumber. But if you have a burst or broken concept, then you need philosophy. And much like pipes don't last forever, says someone who doesn't know where the pipes in his home are and couldn't fix them if his life literally depended on it, concepts don't last forever either. And this is an open-ended process. We don't value plumbers because they make progress in plumbing, but because they maintain existing systems and install new ones when it's necessary. We'll always need plumbers. And if any plumbers are watching this, we appreciate you. You're awesome, and we wish you got paid more money. And if Midgley is right, we'll always need philosophers. If any philosophers are watching this, I'm sorry. It's sort of like, as long as there is we'll need plumbers. And as long as there is we'll need philosophers. And while they definitely had different vibes, Midgley, Adorno, and Deleuze and Guattari seem to all share some overlap in how they see philosophy. Now, for Midgley, philosophy is needed when previous assumptions and concepts reach their own limits and need fixing. For Deleuze and Guattari, various forms of chaos, like a busted septic pipe, necessitate the creation of new concepts, which then help us figure out how to live differently in our changing reality. And for Adorno, the job of philosophy isn't to simply look at existing systems and affirm them, but to change them actively in pursuit of better understanding the world. All of this at least loosely gels with the spirit of the ancient Greeks, for whom philosophy was about developing new concepts that engendered both internal examination and the examination of society. In all of these cases, philosophy was never just about figuring out what is true in a disengaged academic manner. It's also, by necessity, never been apolitical or at the service of dominant political systems. Much like how Socrates was the gadfly of Athens, stinging the state out of its complacency, philosophers have always been the small voices calling large and powerful systems into question. And as long as we still live in systems riddled with both literal and metaphorical busted pipes, full of both literal and metaphorical often causing us to very literally reevaluate our concepts and assumptions, we're gonna need philosophy, philosophers, and of course, plumbers. But what do you guys think? Does philosophy remain as useful as ever? Should AI models just be answering these questions for us? Or is philosophy the one thing that robots can't take from us? Let us know in the comments. Thank you so much to all our patrons for your support. Now, if you've ever wanted to tell me why I'm wrong in a more direct fashion, consider joining our Patreon. You can get on our Discord server where you can talk to me directly, tell me why I'm wrong, start debates, really try to piss me off. It'll be fun. You'll also get videos early with no ads, extra audio and video content, and some other fun perks. But also, thank you to everyone for watching this video, for engaging with us, for asking questions and leaving comments that inspire us to make videos like this. It really does mean a lot. And just thank you so much for continually feeding the algorithm, because it's gotta eat. In the meantime, tip your local plumbers, and we'll see you later.